Hello again. In the sacred texts of Hinduism, the status of the Vedas, including both the Samhitas and the Upanishads, is clear, since they're Shruti, right? And the significance of the epics as Smriti is pretty clear as well. But then we face hundreds of texts that would probably be classified as Smriti, what is remembered, but which are seen as more or less authoritative by different Hindus. Many of these writings are used in sectarian fashion by the devotees of various gods and goddesses, or by the followers of particular philosophical schools. In this lecture, I'll try to give you a sense of what's in the vast Hindu canon, and then we'll focus on two of the most prominent, influential texts, the Laws of Manu and the Bhagavad Gita. At about the time the Upanishads were composed, so that's 700 BCE to 300 CE, there were other texts that attempted to synthesize Vedic lore in a systematic fashion. These became known as the Vedanga, and it means the limbs of the Vedas. They covered 6 topics: etymology, grammar, phonetics, meter, astronomy, and ritual. Often these took the form of sutras. So those are texts that are composed of short aphorisms that were meant to be memorized and could sometimes be rather cryptic without the guidance of a teacher or a commentary. They're seen as perhaps aids to memorization. The word sutra refers to a thread that ties things together, and it's related to the English word suture. Other sutras became the basis for the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy. For instance, the Brahma Sutra was a key text of Vedanta, and that was the school that focuses on the identity of Atman and Brahman. And there's also a Yoga Sutra as well, which provides a clear outline of the Yoga school. We'll see the word sutra in later lectures when we talk about Buddhism, but in that tradition, it refers to the words of the Buddha rather than systematic treatises written by experts, followers in particular fields. The sutras were thought to have been composed by specific individuals, so they're considered smriti. Remember that the shruti are revelations, or they're sort of eternal texts that are heard by rishis, by seers. So these are written in prose, generally. They're composed by individuals. And then there are somewhat later texts known as the Shastras. So the sutras, and then later the Shastras, which are also treatises devoted to specialized topics. But Shastras are frequently written in verse. So the Dharma Sutras, those are basically rules for moral appropriate behavior, written about 300 to 100 BCE, were followed by the Dharma Shastras, beginning about 100 CE. The Laws of Manu, which I'll return to in a few minutes, is the earliest and most famous of the Dharma Shastras. So it's written in verse, right? Dharma was considered one of the 3 aims of life appropriate for Hindus, along with artha, worldly success, kama, enjoyments, or for alliteration to get all 3 of those, piety, profit, and pleasure. Now, sometimes Hindus talked about a 4th aim in life, which was moksha, or liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. So you may have heard of the Artha Shastra, that's a book devoted to kingship, statecraft, and military policy, written maybe 200 CE, and the Kama Sutra, which outlines the principles of marriage and family life, including sexuality. Despite its name, the Kama Sutra is actually a Shastra treatise. And then later still came the Puranas, and the word means ancient texts, which are lengthy collections of myth and legend about the gods and ancient sages. There are 18 major Puranas and dozens of minor ones, written from about 400 CE to 1000 CE. These Puranas are associated with the major gods and goddesses of Hinduism, such as Vishnu, including his avatars or incarnation of Rama and Krishna, Shiva, and Shakti, a female divinity manifest in goddesses such as Lakshmi, Parvati, or Kali. And these are, opposed to these gods of the Puranas, are different from the primary gods of Vedic rituals or ancient Brahmanism, people like Indra and Agni. The 18 major Puranas together comprise about 400,000 verses of Sanskrit poetry, so maybe 4 times the length of the Mahabharata. This huge body of text covers a little of everything: stories, philosophy, moral teachings, medical advice, information about architecture and veterinary science, especially with regard to elephants, even recipes. This ever-growing body of sacred literature, endlessly recited and adapted and transformed, was one of the primary ways that Hinduism was able to retain its vitality. The Puranas are especially known as manifestations of bhakti, or devotion. They advocate an intense, emotional, passionate faith in a particular deity, and that deity may in turn promise salvation to all, regardless of caste. One of the most important of these texts is the Bhagavata Purana, which tells the various avatars of Vishnu, especially Krishna. His life story is narrated at great length, including his escapades as the irresistible lover of cow-herding women. Their overwhelming desire for Krishna represents the devotion of all of his devotees, and their despair at his absence or separation is similarly interpreted as spiritual allegory. Hinduism is more comfortable with religious eroticism than the major monotheistic traditions, though we'll see a bit of this later in the Hebrew Song of Songs and Muslim Sufi poetry. So in the vast category of Smriti literature, we have sutras, shastras, and Puranas, and then after Puranas, there are even later, more sectarian texts that are held to be sacred by some Hindus, but not by others. These include devotional poetry from the 6th to the 16th centuries, written in vernacular languages such as Tamil, Marathi, and Hindi, as well as a whole genre of Sanskrit texts known as Tantra. Those were written from the 8th to the 11th centuries. The Tantra, which are usually presented as dialogues between Shiva, the god Shiva, and his consort, include secret spells and incantations and gestures and taboo-defying rituals for initiates that were thought to unlock the powers of the cosmos, or to reveal the divine nature of the body, or perhaps to hasten liberation from the cycle of reincarnation, right? To get that moksha that I talked about earlier. We'll see some tantric forms of Buddhism in Lecture 18. Hinduism is more like a family of related religions than a single monolithic tradition, and it's less defined by a fixed scriptural canon than Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Hindus generally accept the authority of the Vedas, even if they encounter them only rarely, remember sort of life cycle rituals and such, and they feel connected to the great epics, but there's a great deal of variation in their use of other sacred texts. Still, whether they've read it or not, the laws of Manu, dated to about 200 CE, has a tremendous impact on everyday life in India. This relatively short, straightforward text outlines rules and customs and expectations for the 4 major castes. It's attributed to Manu, the legendary progenitor of the human race, and it purports to reveal his words to a group of sages when they ask him about the laws by which society should be harmoniously organized, right? It's all about dharma, about duty. In Sanskrit, the text is often referred to by the title Manu Smriti, so it's easy to remember which category it goes in. The Laws of Manu was actually one of the first Sanskrit texts to be translated into English by Sir William Jones in 1794. The English were just at that time trying to set up laws and a legal system, and they hoped in that text that they would find some legal precedent in Hinduism. It's actually not exactly laws so much as I said expectations and norms, but it's a valuable text nonetheless, and one that's had a tremendous impact on everyday life. But before we talk about specifically what's in the text, a quick refresher here. There are 4 major castes in India called Varnas. There are the Brahmins, those are the priests and the teachers, and then Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, the Vaishyas, who are farmers and merchants, and finally Shudras, the laborers or servants. All 4 castes were thought to have been descended from the Indo-European Aryans, who migrated into India about 1500 BCE and brought with them the Vedas and the Vedic religion, though only the 3 upper castes could participate fully in Vedic rituals or receive an initiation known as being twice born. Outside the system were outcasts, now referred to as Dalits, who were descendants of indigenous peoples in the Indian subcontinent. One of the late Vedas memorably describes the 4 Varnas as those who were born from a primordial giant's mouth, that's the Brahmins, from his arms, the Kshatriyas, the warriors, from his thighs, that are the Vaishyas, the merchants and farmers, and then his feet, and those are the Shudras, the servants. For twice-born males, so males who belong to those 3 upper castes, Life was divided into 4 stages, or ashrams: the student, a householder, forest dweller, and a wandering ascetic. A man became a forest dweller when he retired from a career after becoming a grandfather, and he divested himself of possessions, giving up social connections and responsibilities, and then moved to a hut in the forest, perhaps with his wife. And then in the last stage, as a wandering ascetic, he becomes homeless and leaves everything behind, even his wife, so that he can devote himself full-time to meditation, asceticism, and spiritual pursuits, endeavoring to achieve liberation from reincarnation, moksha, by renouncing all desires and attachments. Actually, a person beginning his life as a wandering ascetic renounces everything and even performs his own funeral rites. After he's dead, he's thrown into the river Ganges rather than cremated. These 4 stages of life, the first 2, student and householder, pretty clear, right? And then forest dweller and wandering ascetic, that represented the ideal, even though it was probably beyond the capacities or even the aspirations of most people. Most people simply want to be reborn into a better life the next go-round in reincarnation, rather than trying to achieve liberation all in one go, all in this life. Okay, we're ready now to talk about the laws of Manu. That text is comprised of 2,684 verses divided into 12 chapter-length books. It starts with the creation of the world, including an account of the origins of the 4 varnas, the 4 major castes. Then chapters 2 through 6 outline the rules for different life stages of a Brahmin male. For instance, students should avoid honey, meat, perfumes, garlands, savory foods, women, all foods that have turned sour, causing injury to living beings, and so forth. So lots of rules for students. The laws of Manu specify appropriate teacher-student relations. And then for householders, there are guidelines for marriage, sacrifices, hospitality, offerings to ancestors, proper clothing and hygiene and food and social interactions and study. For example, it was considered improper to recite Vedic verses when on a horse, or in a tree, on a ship, during a fight, or soon after eating, or in the presence of a Shudra, the lowest of the 4 castes. By the way, one of the advantages of the epics and the Puranas was that anyone could enjoy and learn from these stories, even women and those of lower caste, right? They were open to everyone. Generally, people were expected to stay within their own castes for marriages, for meals, and other social interactions. There were also warnings about polluting influences that would compromise one's purity, including coming into contact with forbidden foods, with death, members of the lower castes, menstruating women, ejaculation, childbirth, defecation, etc. Chapter 6 provides regulations for forest dwellers and for wandering ascetics, those last 2 of the stages of the ideal life. The laws of Manu are certainly written from a male perspective, though they also specify guidelines for women, usually in a supportive or a dependent relationship, as they transition from daughters to wives to mothers and then widows. Women are sometimes regarded as deficient or dangerous, but on the other hand, occasionally we read verses that praise and honor them. It says, "Where women are revered, there the gods rejoice, but where they are not, no right bears fruit. Where female relatives grieve, that family soon comes to ruin, but where they do not grieve, it always prospers." Chapters 7 through 9 of the Laws of Manu turn their attention to the Dharma of Kshatriyas, with rules for kingship regarding administration, diplomacy, war, and guidelines for the legal system. And that includes witnesses, contracts, assault and theft, domestic issues such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. The Laws of Manu conclude with a chapter on problematic situations. So this might include children born of mixed caste parents, and what occupations are allowable for those who can't find work within their traditional caste duties. There's a chapter on the penance for sins, and a chapter on the workings of karma, which explains why people are reborn into different castes. And now a tough question. Why should those of us living in a postmodern world care about a pre-modern text like the Laws of Manu? Clearly, there's a great deal here that doesn't make sense in contemporary society, or might even be offensive. I would imagine that most of us are uncomfortable with the notion of social status being fixed by birth rather than by merit. by the general exclusion of women from study and professional life and spiritual endeavors, and by certain things or people being pronounced impure or unholy. We'll revisit this challenge when we take a look at law codes in the Hebrew Bible, where just being born an Israelite gave one certain advantages, and various foods or substances or people were considered unclean. We'll talk about why ritual impurity is not quite the same thing as sin. Back in India, the laws of Manu have historical value, and they may provide insights into some of the traditional values that are still part of Indian society. Caste regulations have weakened over time, particularly in urban areas, but they still play an important role in politics and marriage arrangements. So personal ads in the newspapers or online still usually indicate one's caste. As in Judaism, some of the expectations for priests have spread throughout society, so that education is a high priority for many Indian women and lower castes, not just for Brahmin males. But reading a sacred text like the Laws of Manu also gives us a chance to reconsider some of our own cultural assumptions. I like the idea that all men are created equal, right? That's one of our Western values. But a moment's worth of reflection reveals that to be a convenient fiction. Some people are smarter than others, or better looking, or were born into more prosperous families. And remember, Hinduism's law of karma provides an explanation for those differences that satisfies our human need for justice. But doesn't it make sense to have different expectations for those of varying abilities? It may not make so much sense to treat everyone exactly the same. And perhaps there isn't a single standard of achievement by which we can measure everyone. As much as we may recoil at the notion of social class fixed by caste, in the West, we tend to determine social class by wealth, whereas in India, you could still be a high caste Brahmin even if you were poor. And though we like to think that anyone can succeed through hard work and ability, in actuality, there seems to be less social mobility in the United States than in many other modernized countries. If you are successful enough to have bought a course from the great courses, chances are that your parents were successful as well. The advantages bestowed by wealth, upbringing, education, and social connections are pervasive and highly determinative, even if it seems a bit unfair. It's also striking that for most of its history, India's social stability came from the kind of dharma advocated by the laws of Manu, rather than from strict law codes. People had a defined place in society, and they acted accordingly because of pressure from family, neighbors, and especially jati. Okay? Jati are the thousands of local self-governing subcastes, mostly based on occupation and ethnicity, within the Varna system. So 4 major Varnas, and then within those, lots and lots of jati that may be people who are potters, or people who come from who are farmers in a certain region, or people who deal with certain kinds of building construction materials and such. There's no doubt that there was a great deal of oppression and the squelching of individuality within the caste system. But people also enjoyed the benefits of strong, cohesive local communities of the sort beloved by conservative thinkers. What does it say about our society that we depend mostly on laws, contracts, and a somewhat intrusive government to keep things running smoothly? Although I certainly enjoy living in a secular society characterized by relative equality and informality, I wonder if we haven't lost something when we jettison notions of sacred and profane. Indeed, questions about purity now seem foreign or even quaint. But are there any people or places or activities that you might regard as particularly holy or sacred? Should there be events or buildings that are off limits to outsiders? Are there aspects of your life which are specifically oriented toward the divine or the spiritual? I know that some people find an almost religious awe in contemplating the cosmos scientifically. Is that reasonable? Is it enough? And if it's a valuable sentiment, how would we pass it on to the next generation? And finally, there may be some bits of wisdom from a text like the Laws of Manu that might be worth adopting in our modern lives. For instance, I like to share with my students Manu's prohibition against mimicking the walk, speech, or mannerisms of one's teacher. Okay, don't do that. And I'm quite taken with the idea that different modes of spirituality might be appropriate at different stages in life, even if those life stages for Americans are not as stringently prescribed as in the laws of Manu. But if you only have the time or inclination to read just one of the sacred texts of Hinduism, of the hundreds and hundreds that are out there, the one you should read ought to be the Bhagavad Gita. And the title means the Song of the Lord. It's a short scripture, just 700 verses, that has it all. As an excerpt from the Mahabharata, so it's an 18-chapter segment from the Mahabharata, it obviously qualifies as Smriti, but its philosophical content and dialogue form make it sound like an Upanishad, and it's often treated as if it were Shruti, oftentimes memorized and recited. Furthermore, it speaks to Hindus of all castes, combining discussions of spiritual insight with advice for worldly success and intense devotionalism. No wonder it has become the best known, most beloved work of Hindu scripture. And it's not surprising that it was the first Sanskrit book to be translated into English, way back in 1785. Since that time, there have been more than 300 additional English translations. You may recall the backstory from the previous lecture. On the eve of the Great War between the 5 Pandava brothers and their evil cousins, Arjuna rides in his chariot between the 2 opposing armies and sees family and friends on both sides. Realizing the enormity of the slaughter to come, he drops his bow, slumps down, and tells his chariot driver, Krishna, that he doesn't want to fight, that kingship and victory are not worth the terrible cost. Arjuna is caught in an impossible situation between his dharma as a warrior and his dharma as a friend, as a family man, as a relative. As a kshatriya, remember this is the ruler warrior, his caste duty is to protect the world and to punish wrongdoers. You can read about that sort of duty for kshatriya in the laws of Manu. Yet if he kills his relatives in the process, he's sure to bring bad karma upon everyone. As the text says, when the family is ruined, the timeless laws of family duty perish. And when duty is lost, chaos overwhelms the family. The sins of men who violate the family create disorder in society that undermines the constant laws of caste and family duty. Remember, dharma is subtle. Sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what you ought to do. Krishna thereupon speaks up and he offers multiple reasons why Arjuna should fight. These justifications can be organized into 3 broad categories. Jnana Yoga, the way of wisdom, Karma Yoga, the way of action, and Bhakti Yoga, the way of devotion. The first, the way of wisdom, draws upon the insights of the Upanishads, in particular the ideas of reincarnation and the oneness of all life. The Bhagavad Gita says, "Know it as indestructible, that by which all is pervaded. No one may cause the destruction of the imperishable one. This man believes the one may kill, that man believes it may be killed. Both of them lack understanding. It can neither kill nor be killed," right? He's talking about Atman or ultimately Brahman, right? It can't really come in and out of existence. It can just be transformed. Such meditations are probably most appropriate for educated Brahmins. The way of action, or Karma Yoga, by contrast, is perhaps best suited for kshatriyas. Krishna tells Arjuna that he must perform his caste duty no matter how unpleasant, because to do otherwise would bring shame upon him and disorder to the world. For a warrior, action is preferable to the inaction or renunciation of a Brahmin, but the secret is to act dispassionately, to do what one has to do without being attached to the fruits of one's actions, without worrying about successes or failure, without being overly consumed by the consequences. In this way, a person can live calmly and peacefully, doing whatever he or she needs to do, but free from distractions of fear and anger. It's not necessary to renounce the world or withdraw from it in the pursuit of spiritual meaning. Okay, that was sort of the plan of Hindu ascetics, sometimes of Brahmins, the forest dwellers, and we'll later see that for Buddhists, the highest calling is to give up home and family and occupation and become a homeless, wandering monk or nun. In the third path, the way of devotion, bhakti yoga, bad karma can be avoided if one surrenders one's deeds to Krishna. The text says, when you have entrusted all actions to me, Krishna is speaking, right, with thought on the highest self, when you have become free from desire, free from the idea of mine, then go ahead and fight with grief gone. A little further on, Krishna suggests that the way of devotion is open to everyone, not just to noble priests or warriors. Krishna says, if one who does evil honors me and not another, that one is thought to be good. That one has begun in the right way. No one who is devoted to me is ever lost. Those who seek refuge in me, even those who come from evil wombs, who come from evil wombs, and that includes or women, or vaishyas, even shudras, they too go on to the highest path. Over the course of the Gita, Krishna gradually reveals himself until in chapter 11, Arjuna asks to see Krishna in his true form. And then follows a terrifying theophany as Arjuna is permitted to behold an infinite being, brighter than 1,000 suns, it says, who encompasses the entire universe with innumerable arms and bellies and faces. Krishna is both creator and destroyer, and Arjuna is shocked to see the chief warriors in both armies hastening into his open mouths, as it says, as so many currents of water in a river might run towards the ocean. Arjuna begs Krishna to return to human form, but clearly any debate is over. Just as when God's voice speaks from the whirlwind in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Job. The Book of the Gita offers an attractive counter to the notion in the Upanishads that salvation comes only to individual renunciants who leave behind all worldly responsibilities. Instead, the Gita demonstrates how spiritual attainment can be won while still honoring the social obligations of family, caste, and community, right? Dharma. This is the reason the Gita has long been chanted in homes and temples, recited at festivals, and is quoted constantly by ordinary Hindus throughout India. Not coincidentally, one of the greatest advocates of the Gita in the 20th century was a man who was intensely involved in politics, though in a singularly selfless way. I'm talking about Mahatma Gandhi, who once said, "For me, the Gita became an infallible guide of conduct. It became my dictionary of daily reference." As a sacred text, the Gita resists simplistic interpretations. Gandhi recognized that taken at face value, the Gita urges men to go into battle, but Gandhi also saw how the Mahabharata as a whole lavishly illustrates the futility of violence and war. And Gandhi reinterpreted the Gita as a book of peace, as an allegory for how we must fight against our own selfish passions, right? The battle that Krishna tells Arjuna he can't escape from, that he needs to go, is like the battle within each of us as individuals, as we attempt to overcome our weaknesses, as we struggle with our own inadequacies. Gandhi loved the self-discipline described at the end of chapter 2 of the Gita. It says there, "He whose mind is not agitated in calamities, and who has no longing for pleasure, free from attachment, fear, and anger, he indeed is said to be a saint of steady wisdom." For both the ancient Kshatriyas and the modern Gandhi, giving into desire is a manifestation of weakness. In closing, I'll just note that in the 21st century, the first Hindu elected to the U.S. Congress, Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, chose to take her oath of office on her personal copy of the Bhagavad Gita. When an interviewer asked about what the book had meant to her in her own military service, she was deployed twice to the Middle East with the Hawaiian National Guard, she initially said that the Gita isn't really about war. The central topics of the Gita, she said, are enlightenment, love for God, selfless service, and how each of us can succeed in our struggles on the battlefields of life. Gabbard then added that during wartime, literal war, she had found great comfort and shelter in the Bhagavad Gita's message of the eternality of the soul and of God's unconditional love.